So basically, what I wanted to do today is set the stage really very briefly, and then give a few examples of types of conflict of interest in research. And then maybe this is the policy piece of me coming out, but give a really brief history of why conflict of interest exists, in particular in the financial realm, so financial conflict of interest. And then give some suggestions as to that I've kind of come up with in terms of that might be considered innovative ways to manage or handle or approach, kind of more broadly approach the issue. So I do want to, this is part of the setting of the stage, and I do want to kind of start with this quote just to kind of make sure that everyone maybe gets a sense of where I'm coming from. And it's an old quote from David Korn, and I'll read it to you. "Conflicts of interest are ubiquitous and inevitable in academic life, indeed in all of professional life. The challenge for academic research is not to eradicate them, which is fanciful and would be inimical to public policy goals, but to recognize and manage them sensibly and effectively." And I think I've highlighted this piece of it because I kind of agree with him. I think this idea that we can completely wipe out conflict of interest, whether it be financial or non-financial, is if we get too caught up in thinking about that, then we're missing the big picture of can we recognize it? And are people who are maybe situated in situations where they may be conflicted, are they recognizing it? And then how to manage them. And this piece, sensibly and effectively, I'm not sure that the research community has reached that point of being able to do it sensibly and effectively. Some of the readings that I've done kind of in preparation for this suggest that maybe there needs to be a little bit more empirical study on different policies and approaches to dealing with conflict of interest. So I wanted to start out with a definition, actually two definitions. So the first one is from Resnick. Conflict of interest is a situation in which one's duties and one's self-interest conflict in a way that has significant chance of corrupting one's perceptions, motivations, actions, passions, values, and or judgments. Now, I kind of have some problems with that definition, and I'm wondering if anyone else, maybe I kind of gave it away with this definition, especially in contrast to this definition. Conflict of interest exists when two or more contradictory interests relate to an activity by an individual or an institution. The conflict lies in the situation, not in any behavior or lack of behavior of the individual. That means the conflict of interest is not intrinsically a bad thing. And I think what I like about this one better is it's not situating the blame on an individual person. This one is using language of corruption and at the outset you think, wow, that's a bad thing. And I think we're already set up with the issue that conflict of interest, the name in and of itself suggests that it's something we should get rid of, avoid, not have, because it just has a negative connotation. And I hope to maybe come back to that towards the end of this brief presentation. So manifestations of conflict of interest. You can ask the question, is money involved? So financial conflict of interest when it is, non-financial conflict of interest when it's not. They've also called those intrinsic, inherent, innate, and I could spend a lot of time talking about those, but I'm probably not. I'll give a couple examples. I think they're really important, and if we have time to globally discuss them, that would be great. But what this brief introduction is largely focused on the financial conflict of interest, and that's I kind of have gotten the sense in talking to people and hearing people that there's and just from what I'm aware of in other academic institutions, there's a big push to really begin trying to foster the partnerships and bringing in industry funding for clinical trials and other types of research in the whole translational spectrum, et cetera. And I think because of that emphasis, we might want to think about some of the innovative ways or potential suggestions that could be done to address or handle financial conflicts of interest. So some examples, I think these are pretty familiar to people, probably especially you who staffs the committee. An investigator holds 200,000 stock in a public company sponsoring her trial. An investigator receives $100,000 in royalties from a company sponsoring his trial. I'm actually kind of curious how these would be dealt with here at Penn State.
Do we get a cut?
Long answer.
I mean, it depends, like Morris said, if there's human subjects involved, then it would pretty much be pretty much a showstopper unless we investigate a little more, have some clever management ways to figure out how we can allow an individual to maintain, some sort of action, continue to work on the trial or not, but otherwise.
So it's interesting that I'm struck by the fact that if human participants are involved, that kind of ratchets it up, which is understandable. But when you think about some of these other underlying conflicts that exist in science, I mean, all researchers, academic researchers, have a conflict of interest in that. To get promotion, career development, you got to get the data so you can publish, and you want that high impact journal. So, I mean, it's
what's unclear. We would probably not let this go in any research, but I'm just saying, yes, the sensitivity is definitely heightened in research. But even if it's basic science, we wouldn't allow this to be able to work like this.
Okay, so but not like this, but you would allow some type of management plan, like.
We would say you probably can't be PI on the studies. There's lots of things.
There has to be a firewall between them and data.
Right. Yeah.
You can, the analysis, and what we have to have other folks helping to analyze the data, and non-conflicting investigators, and helping to direct the study, and disclosure to laboratory members, and I mean, it would be pretty significant.
An elaborate plan, but I think, I like what you said, there has to be a firewall between the investigator and the data, in particular the data collection and the analysis. But I want to raise a question, and I kind of jumping ahead, does that necessarily mean that the individual can't be the PI on the study? I mean, if you have different roadblocks put in place, mean that it's clear that a non-conflicted researcher is actually doing the data analysis, doing the data collection, or wherever the conflict could arise. Yeah, I'm just kind of throwing that out as a potential suggestion.
Sure.
I mean, I feel like a PI makes 1,000 small decisions. So I guess if you had other eyes on the design and other eyes on following the design, then I guess I would be okay with them being a PI. But
yes, what's the role of PI, right? This is the ultimate
what
authority of the study, and that if the PI's responsibilities are to direct the study and all aspects of the study, can they really do that if they're not involved in data interpretation or data analysis? I mean, the
PI can decide not to publish null findings,
sure,
which could be to their financial advantage.
Right.
So
That's tricky.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that this is like I said, I'm kind of jumping ahead. I think it's something that we don't talk about enough and explore. I mean, the immediate reaction is the person can't be the PI on the study, or this can't go forward the way it is. And again, I'm not claiming to be the innovator of that suggestion. It's based on some of the reading I was doing, just kind of Googling around of other sites. And I think I found this on a comparable campus that gave examples of how this might be managed in that way. But again, I think, as what you said, Sheila, a lot of it depends. And I think that's, again, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but the bottom line is everything is very case dependent. And so, I think that's something to keep in mind as well. And here's another example. An investigator has invented a technology which has been licensed, but no royalties have yet been received. The company to which the technology is licensed is sponsoring his research. Again, this is kind of a complicated situation. And why I'm maybe, I guess you could say, playing devil's advocate, or find myself in that position, is if we have this goal of translation and building these relationships and fostering development, some of the, in terms of the technologies, the bench to bedside beyond, are we going to be pushing academics who actually have the expertise to be doing some of that out of any interest of wanting to do that? On the flip side, are we going to be putting in potentially such barriers that industry partners are going to say, forget it, it's not worth it? And so, it's always worth, I think, stopping and asking us, is what we have in place and what we're doing really reaching the end goal? That's kind of what my goal was in just raising these. So some non-financial, I think we're all kind of familiar with these, the dual role that a physician investigator often has when they're recruiting participants that could potentially be their patients. And then something that all of us have probably faced, and that's in the context of the peer review. I mean, academic research is built on peer review, whether it's for manuscripts or grants, and sometimes you can have these sticky situations where you have very limited number of people who have expertise in that area, and so if you don't ask them to review publications or grants, then you kind of are out of luck because you don't have the expertise to review it, but that we're setting people up for conflict of interest right there. And in this case that I kind of, created myself, it's really interesting when you initially agree to accept the publication, which I'll admit I've kind of done this. You say, oh yeah, I'll review it. Doesn't look like there's any problem. And then once I open it up, I kind of go in and realize, crap. And so then, you have to, being aware and recognizing these intrinsic things, which, like I said, I'm not going to, this will be the last slide I talk about this, but these I think are really critical, these intrinsic conflict of interest, these non-financial. They exist all over the place. The one that I mentioned in terms of academic promotion. An example of how to deal with those, in a paper I was reading, I can't remember, I think Salito is the first author, it's an old paper, suggested that at least with studies that use human participants and have consent, you could have a nice little short, succinct paragraph that says, and you should know that, kind of describing this, all investigators in this have some conflict because we want to publish this data, and our careers are based on the success of this study in recruitment. The language was a lot more elegant than what I just said, but I think I never thought of that. Kind of contrasts with their desire to shorten the informed consent document, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Sorry, go ahead.
Do you think,
sorry.
I'm struggling with why you would do that, given what we know about how when you disclose conflict of interest to patients, they just trust you more.
So I think it's in the balance of transparency, right? I mean, right now, if you have a financial conflict of interest, you do disclose that in the consent document. And I think there are actually studies, I mean, there's mixed data, right? There are studies that indicate that patients actually are okay with their physicians who have developed technology that they may be using or et cetera, because they know that the expert is using that. So I think, it's mixed views, and that's a good point, but, this can hold that thought, and we'll go back to that. So I think another question to ask is who or what might be conflicted. We just talked about some individual conflicts, but institutional conflict is really, I think, important to consider too. And it's interesting that I don't think, there's no federal mandate that institutions have an institutional conflict of interest for the institution's conflicts of interest, so not the individuals. Some institutions do. A small portion of academic NIH-funded universities do, but not a lot. And I know that it's getting more increased attention, and it's probably something we need to pay attention to. The suggestions I have are probably largely focused in the context of individual, but I think they may be applicable in the context of institutional as well. So some possible examples: an institution has an investment portfolio. The company that they have that is included in their portfolio has approached the institution to say, we'll give you this big chunk of money to kind of help grow and develop your Department of Molecular and Genomic Biology. Now, I mean, to me it seems like there would be a way to kind of manage that. You'd have to be kind of careful, but I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as we knew about it, and I guess, to me, that it would be more of a problem if one of my institutional leaders was on the board of directors of this company, what have you. The fact that it's part of our portfolio that's probably being managed by, fund managers or something like that.
Yeah.
What if they wanted to name it the Novartis Department of Molecular and Genomic Biology?
Wow.
Because there is a Penn State policy about naming
Yes.
it.
Yeah, and that's actually, there's a building like that at Berkeley.
That's a PR problem though, not like a conflict of interest problem.
No, it actually turned into a conflict of interest problem back, I don't know if it's it might have been the late 1990s, because it's kind of a long story, but there was a faculty member who was up for tenure, and I think Novartis does a lot with genetically modified organisms. So a faculty member was up for tenure. He also happened to be a faculty member that had a lot of data and research that was, for lack of a better phrase, anti-genetically modified organisms, plants. Someone who was on the full faculty and on the review board had stock interest in the company. So it was a really convoluted case. I think the guy up for tenure didn't get tenure, but then appealed, and there was a whole, I'm sure, big mess, and he ended up getting tenure. But
I mean, in this case, we would also want to be careful about further research contracts with this company. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, so we would, want to make sure that's done, with scrutiny, the same level of care we do all of our contracts, and nothing would be in different negotiations with that versus others.
yeah, your comment brings to mind when I was kind of transitioning into science policy, and I had a little stint in the tech transfer office at the University of Michigan. A woman that I kind of considered my mentor, who did a lot with the contracts. I think she was associate director of the Office of Sponsored Research. I heard her say a number of times that academic institutions just really need to stand up and realize that they don't have to bow down to industry. Industry needs academic institutions just as much as academic institutions think they need industry. And I think her perspective from the seat that she sat in was that oftentimes where institutions are just kind of willing to wimp out to whatever the industry sponsor wants because they have the wallet, they're paying the dollars. And I think that's something to kind of keep in mind as well. I mean, it's something that's stuck in my head for the last decade or so. So another example, and this is again convoluted, and why I put this up here is because it's actually, I think, a mix of individual and institutional. So even we look at individual conflicts of interest as being largely individual conflicts of interest, but when you get down to the whole nuances of how royalties are distributed in terms of licensing and all that, you could, I think, maybe make an argument, kind of, that the institution has a conflict of interest as well, right? Because when a technology is licensed and royalties start to come in, it's not just the investigator who's getting something, the institution is getting something back as well in different domains.
So I mean, it seems to me what makes a conflict of interest troubling is not that there's money flowing in one direction or another, but where the money is flowing, those to whom the money is flowing are in a position to influence decision-making, either around patient care, so that they're getting money and they have to make decisions about using a technology or a drug or something that is biased by the fact that they personally profit by using more of it, or if the company does well, or if the institution is somehow going to make a decision that would both benefit their bottom line as well as benefit the company, and maybe those things are related. And so there seems to be in this parsing out of this, there needs to be sort of a discussion of what is the decision that's being potentially influenced by the bringing in of money or profit or whatever.
That's a really good point, and that kind of goes back to the initiating part of the discussion where Sheila said, well, it kind of depends. I mean, we'd have to unpack that more. I think an overall, I'm sure this is how you folks handle it here, but when these situations come up, it's really not thinking there's a cookie cutter model. It's kind of really looking at the full situation and being hopefully willing to work with all the different potential decision makers / stakeholders involved to think about the way to get the research done. So assuming that's the goal. So another little bullet point I wanted to make is I think it's really important to ask the question, is it real or perceived? Either way, it's important to have a management plan in place and to recognize it. When I was thinking about that, I think sometimes it can be difficult to ascertain. It's going to depend on who you ask, and it's dynamic. I mean, something that is not real and is just perceived may, with the change of things, actually, change of situation, change of the economy or what have you, may all of a sudden become a real problem. So this is my little background, and I hope you bear with me for a few slides. This is my my policy wonkish coming out in me. So why do we have financial conflict in academic research? A lot of people they turn to this series of events at the end of the 1970s, double-digit inflation and unemployment, predicted loss of U.S. leadership in high technology to other countries, prediction that U.S. universities, U.S. universities were performing R&D, a lot of it funded by the government, but few inventions were actually being translated and research reaching the commercial sector. And what's interesting is prior to 1980, I'm sure many of you know this, but the U.S. government owned IP that resulted from any of the work that it was supporting. And some people say that because the U.S. government owned it and because of the bureaucracy involved, a lot of that technology just sat on the shelf and didn't go out. So this led to the Bayh-Dole Act, 1980. And I think it's kind of interesting what is included in this act, in that it allowed or enabled academic institutions to file patents on technologies, inventions. I mean, it allowed them to own that and have some ownership. But then it set some parameters as to how they were to use that technology. In the licensing, if you really read the legislation, it says institutions should give preference to small businesses, startup type things, not the big global behemoths. And that institutions should actively promote the commercialization, and actually NIH can step in and pull out, take back ownership. And then this issue of the division of royalties, how the royalties should go, actually stating that, some of the royalties should go to the investigator, the others should go back to the institution for these types of activities. What is interesting about the Bayh-Dole is I think talking to some of my policy colleagues, it really brought up this whole field of technology transfer. And I think increasingly some folks would say in the science policy world that because of Bayh-Dole, it's brought about lots of good things, but academic institutions are sometimes maybe putting too much, they're looking too much to their investigators to do the technology transfer, to bring in these extra dollars, to help kind of fill the bottom line. It's one argument that I've heard from some of my policy colleagues. Another thing that has kind of driven this increasing presence or awareness of financial conflict of interest is what a sociology colleague of mine calls a market imperative. Increasing emphasis on deliverables of translation by the public and policymakers, demanding, not just looking, but actually demanding to some extent a return on their investment. A lot of states over the last several decades have actually turned to their state universities as drivers of innovation and economic development. I think one of President Obama's recent State of the Union addresses actually turned to research and science as a driver of economic growth and prosperity in the United States. So you also have this issue of, which kind of leads to bridging the valley of death, and a focus on translation. Many of you probably saw this Nature article a number of years ago. And NIH has really kind of captured that as well with NCATS, CTSA, and the focus is really on this translation, this bench to bedside and commercialization. So all of this sets up, I think, for a situation where we've created a culture in which, on the one hand, we want the translation, which to have to happen realistically, maybe not all the time, but we have to come to grips with the fact that there has to be some type of financial investment from people other than the academic institutions, from the NIH and advocacy groups. And I think, so we have that on the one hand, but on the other hand, there still seems to be this, in some sectors, maybe largely in the public, who are unfamiliar with academic research, this antiquated image of what it means to do academic research, and that we're in our ivory tower, we have this lily white, presence, we don't interact with those big bad pharma people, we're untainted. And so those two things come in tension. So, we have this current system where to recognize and manage effectively and sensibly conflict of interest. So we do place the burden on the investigator, largely, right? I'm always getting the conflict of interest forms that I have to go through and actually, rather than just automatically click, 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 I've tried to, in the last couple of years, since I teach conflict of interest to graduate students, I've forced myself to, every so often, stop and actually read what the form is asking me to make certain that when I click no, that actually I mean no. I don't have any conflicts of interest, but I think, we put the burden on the investigator, and yes, we've done it in an automated way to try to streamline it, but in some extent, I think it alleviates the investigator from having to really think about what they're doing, and anything has changed. We rely heavily on disclosure, and then these are reviewed by institutional committees, but to the best of my knowledge, it's not really common practice to have a member from the public, or several members from the public, on these institutional review boards. And I think, this is one of the pieces that I have a bullet on later is, why don't we? And do you? Okay, yeah, I think that should be common practice, and maybe more than just one, but a couple people to kind of bring in the perspectives. Because largely what we're concerned about is the perception our colleagues have, but but also the public perception. And then, as we've been talking, we do this, we put in place management plans as needed, and we do, most institutions, I believe, are pretty good about the case-by-case basis. So, some limitations, I think a big one is it requires individual investigators to realize there's a potential conflict of interest. And I'm not certain that maybe all investigators always are aware of that. So how could you change that? You could do more education. Yeah, but if you're going to do that, I think it needs to be a very interactive, dynamic process where you're actually having discussions, and it shouldn't happen just at the trainee level. I think these are things that need to happen throughout an individual's career. For responsible conduct of research that I teach at my institution, there's a set of small group discussions on conflict of interest. I'm not facilitating these anymore. I've gotten faculty graduate school faculty to facilitate those discussions. So if nothing else, when they're doing that twice a year, they're kind of forced to actually stop and think about these conflict of interest issues a little bit more than just clicking quickly through the form that's filling their inbox. I think yeah, I'm not so this gets at the lack of really full public participation, and it sounds like you have actually implemented that to some extent. I think a big thing is when we have the disclosures, we just stop at, I need to disclose this. We don't say why it's important. And I think that's where a lot of things are lost. If you just look at someone has received this dollar amount, it immediately looks bad. But if you actually stop and take the time to explain it, now how to actually do that, I have some ideas. In publications, it would actually take probably a significant section of word count that maybe journal editors wouldn't be happy with, but it might be worth it. And I think, disclosure right now is largely limited to investigators, peers, journal editors, and reviewers. We aren't really going out and publicly, at least in aggregate, disclosing to the public, to potential patients, to patients who may be potential research participants.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that the publication should explain why there's a financial conflict of interest, or why the existence of a conflict of interest is problematic? I wasn't quite sure where, or both, or?
I think if the conflict exists, explain why, or could potentially be perceived to exist. So why has the research proceeded and been allowed to proceed in that type of situation? And what benefit has it, why was it good when you're kind of weighing the goods and the bads, risks, the harms? Why did a committee or what have you decide that actually I think the good aspect of this outweighs potential harms, so we're going to let this go forward because of improving human health, or the only way this could be translated is because of this partnership, the only way this clinical trial could be funded is because of this partnership.
So you're seeing this as a mechanism for increasing public trust in the enterprise?
Yeah.
About transparency.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to imagine what it would look like, saying, well, the reason this conflict of interest exists is because because we live in a capitalist society, and people should be free to make a lot of money if the opportunity arises. And if this person was not permitted to make this money, they would leave the institution, the research wouldn't go forward, and and health wouldn't be improved in that way. I mean, that might be the accurate answer, is that, people say, I have a right to make a bunch of money, and either you fire me or you let me do my work, or I'll leave.
I'm not saying...
And I can't imagine that in a publication.
No, I'm not saying that a disclosure that's made that wouldn't pass the sniff test actually be allowed to proceed, and then you kind of explain it all in the publication, in the acknowledgments. But when you look at publications, often there may be things that are, so-and-so received this amount of money from blah. Well, why did they receive that amount of money? At the surface, to me, who hasn't looked at the reason, I say, well, that's kind of sketchy. But if clearly the Conflict of Interest Committee at that institution didn't. So what did they know that made them say, well, let's have this go forward? They probably knew that, well, so-and-so is a postdoc who is on a fellowship that comes from Merck that was funneled through the graduate school and has nothing to do really with any specific product or research. It's really just directed to the postdocs, stipend, salary. So that type of, I think is what I was getting at in this context. I don't know if I cleared that up.
So, yeah, so
it's not why it exists in terms of the larger society. It's almost what's been done to ameliorate the conflict.
Yeah, or why did it allow to
why was it permitted?
Why was it permitted? That's a better way of saying it.
Although that could also start with, because we have a capitalist society.
Yeah, it could. So some possible outside the box thinking, we've kind of talked a little bit about these, and these would be things that are just kind of global and wouldn't be necessarily when a specific conflict has been identified. And we've talked about this, disclosing the details of why the relationship is important. I think to take that to the next step is, and I don't know how practical this would be. It'd be interesting to see if it actually caused too much more consternation and harm in terms of angering patients, or if it wouldn't. But so at my institution right now, for the last couple of weeks, there's been a couple billboard type thingies on easels announcing, I don't know, someone's around doing some type of site visit, and it's just making a public disclosure. So why couldn't we have a couple of those sitting around in the lobbies, like the lobby here that says, patients of Penn State, Hershey, we just want you to know that our investigators have some relationships with the wording, the details in the wording. I know I can see the looks in some of your faces. The relationships with certain biotechs or what have you. This is being done because blah, blah, blah. We have these type of people who are managing or overseeing this. If you have questions, contact blah, 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 blah. I don't know. I mean, and this is not, again, just my idea. This, there was a report that came out of the National Academy of Sciences a couple of years ago. I guess it wasn't an actual report, it was just a write-up from a workshop. And a number of the participants in that workshop actually came up with that idea too. So I came up with it, but then when I was doing my reading, I was like, okay, I'm not crazy. It's, other people, smart people smarter than me are thinking about this. I think we've already talked about this, bringing non-institutional, non-science individuals onto the conflict of review boards. It seems to me what's interesting with the IRB and with conflict of interest, in your situation, you go to one person. Well, why not have a couple people from the public? I mean, there's kind of power in numbers. And sometimes one individual who's kind of the lone person in the room who may feel that they don't know anything, they may say more or have more to say if they have a couple people with them. I've experienced that in my sitting on the Mayo Clinic's Biobanks Access Committee. For a long time, we just had one community advisory board member. Now we have two. And they actually say a little bit more when there's actually two of them present to kind of agree with each other or back each other. I won't go into this, but kind of thinking about the civic scientist notion that I talked about I guess it was just yesterday, with Uncle Bill. How might we be training or encouraging scientists, and even anyone involved in the research endeavor in academic institutions, to kind of just really in general terms kind of explain, well, yeah, it looks kind of sketchy on the outside, but when most institutions have these types of relationships, this is done, this is done, and this is done, and giving some examples where it's actually worked out and where there's not been some negative press. This leads into my next one. We always highlight failures, and we never go out, well, we as a community don't actively seek out having the failures highlighted. The press comes and looks for them, but maybe there should be more of an effort to push the press into doing stories about where these types of relationships have actually worked out. Maybe not the New York Times or the LA Times, but why not, I don't know what the local paper is here, but why not the local paper here, or in Rochester, the Rochester Post-Bulletin. When a conflict of interest is recognized, again, these are some really kind of just some suggestions. We've already talked about this, and that's when we have situations where at the surface it looks like the PI just, no way, this person can't be the PI. Do we really, let's step back and ask ourselves, are we really sitting down and thinking about, well, what if we did this? What if we did this? Or what if we did this or this? Can we, do we have this list of a checkoff list that we've gone through? And I don't know that institutions actually do that. Maybe they do it more thoroughly than I'm aware of. This I think happens, but it's all in the framing, right? And so when there's a situation that calls for an independent reviewer or someone separate from the study to actually kind of be involved in the oversight and review, why don't we give it a name that is, a trusted advisor or something? Something that has a little bit more, doesn't sound so bad. Doesn't sound like you are a bad person, so we have to have this person babysitting you. More like, you know what? We all recognize this is a delicate situation. Let's think about having someone that you could consider a trusted advisor. Go ahead.
I was going to say, could you see an institutional role for, imagine the Conflict of Interest Review Committee or the IRB identifies certain higher risk studies for some of these conflict of interest and said, we think that you as the research ethicist ought to be that person.
I could.
Have you seen that work other places?
I have not that I'm aware of. But that when I kind of put that down, I thought, so who could be a trusted advisor? But well, that is one person who could be a trusted advisor, potentially. Kind of a liaison type, mediator type person that, that is really is tried to be as independent as possible. But it's an interesting thing to try and pilot. And then, a lot of these things that are being thrown out here, they're being thrown out, but there's no empirical data to say, well, this works, this doesn't work, why doesn't it work, that type of thing.
So with a trusted advisor whose salary is being paid by the institution and whose job is dependent on pleasing the institutional hierarchy, which creates its own. No, I mean, it's a conflict. I mean, you would have a conflict of interest in that position of the mediator.
But I think as a research ethics, in research ethics, you always have a conflict. When someone comes to me and they want to get the protocol through the IRB, I'm paid by the institution. There's always that conflict.
Right, but I think there are two different sort of framings of this. One is the framing of when there's outside money coming in, the interest of the institution may be to get some of the money, but the interest of the institution that puts someone like this in place is in order to maintain at least the perception, if not the reality, of some division of interest in their firewalls. If the institution is, if the conflict is within the institution, and that's why we argued really hard years ago that it's important that people who are the ethicists be able to be, maintained on the College of Medicine side so that they don't have those they can't be walked to their car for being a troublemaker in terms of raising concerns about how things are done at the institution. So I think, again, in the same way that there are firewalls put in place for the researcher, these roles can be protected in certain ways in the same way that, when division of labor.
Yeah, it would take a lot of thinking and deliberation and trial and error probably, but I kind of agree with you because I think there's a number of situations where we set institutional staff up to be in inherent conflict of interest. And then this is something I have no idea how palatable it would be, but when an investigator has some type of significant conflict of interest, here the underlying question is, it's really forcing the investigator to say, so what's your goal? Is your goal to get the research done? Or is your goal to be surviving in the capitalist society? So, I don't know how easy in terms of, the back-end bureaucracy to redirect funds, but if the goal of the research, like I kind of did in the middle when I got on my policy thing, is to foster translation and bring technologies to the public sector and improve society and all that good stuff, then the investigator shouldn't have too much of a problem with that. And if they do, then yeah, there is a real conflict, and they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. And I think asking investigators to ask that question when they're in a situation, a financial situation, conflict of interest, but probably I think a lot of these could be applied to the inherent or the non-financial conflict of interest as well. Ask, so what is my end goal here? I have two supposed interests. What is my primary, what am I claiming is my primary interest? What is my secondary? And what am I really truly, can I focus just on the primary and just not worry about, not worry about the secondary, but remove the secondary interest? I don't know.
It's an interesting idea, but how many people, forget about the financial, how many people would be willing to sort of work that hard to publish papers and say, this research was done by Penn State Hershey, the end. The white label, yes, you want your team to win, but you want your name on the jersey.
So if we could change the culture of science, which is a bigger issue, I think in that context, can we step back and ask, are we actually measuring the right things for promotion? And is really the number of publications, am I just a number? That really increasingly irks me that Jen McCormick is this number that's listed on my institutional CV. That's all I am. I'm not quality, I'm quantity. So I think that your point kind of raises the larger issue of examining the culture of science and how we actually look at merit. And that would require a huge paradigm shift, which I'm not sure.
It may be examining human psychology more than, as much as the culture. You could make it even more detailed, just look at the author order, right?
Yeah.
It's a...
We may have to move to that, though. I'm kind of thinking of this on the fly. I've been on a number of publications where my name is not in the byline. In fact, there may be only one or two specific names, and then it says, and the eMERGE network. And then at the end, is just a whole page of everyone's names. So it does show up in PubMed, surprisingly. And so if we move to this team science, how long can the author list be? It's an interesting question. Yeah, so we talked about this, and then finally, I just wanted to throw this out there. This is an article I had my students read a couple weeks ago, and the point it was an article called "Confluence, Not Conflict of Interest, Name Change Necessary." I don't know if confluence of interest is the right term for it. This is what the authors wrote. The term conflict of interest is pejorative, it is confrontational and presumptive of inappropriate behavior. Rather, the focus should be on the objective, which is to align secondary interests with the primary objective of the endeavor to benefit patients and society in a way that minimizes the risk of bias. A better term indicative of the objective would be confluence of interest. Like I said, I'm not sure that that's the right term.
Wow.
But I think it's interesting that this came out because over the years that I've done these small groups discussion with conflict of interest, it's interesting how often I hear this idea that no one wants to have anything to do with that because of the negative connotation of the name. Why does it have, I mean, it is a conflict of interest, but isn't there a better?
I don't even understand. I mean, those are completely different concepts. A confluence of interest is not similar to a conflict of interest. It's the opposite.
I don't.
So are they suggesting replacing the term?
Yeah.
I mean, that's bizarre. I mean, it's the opposite meaning of what it is.
And like I said, I don't know, I don't say that I agree with what they're saying, but I put this out there in terms of this idea of rethinking how we think of what we call conflict of interest.
I think it's like the secondary stage, right? How can you get a confluence of, opinions and maybe sort of agreement after identification of the conflict? Right?
Can you get to it?
It's almost like, can you get there, right? So
Or which parts of this are in confluence and which parts are in conflict.
Right, and which parts can you never get the two to meet, right?
Yeah. So,
That's interesting.
it's, again, I just kind of throwing that out there, and when I ran across this article, I thought it was really interesting. It struck me because this issue has come up in a number of small group discussions I've led over the years. So with that, I actually got some reactions.
I think there's an easy way to avoid conflicts of interest, which is to not do anything innovative, right? I mean, so that's part of. I think that's what part of this addresses is that. I agree with Michael's point that it's a 180-degree change in terms of how we think of it, but it's also the case that the sort of eventuality of a conflict of interest is brought about in certain ways because you're trying to do something, right? And so, yes, destigmatize, this probably is not the right terminology, but the idea that that the fact that these emerge comes out of people trying to make a difference. Now, the question is, what's the primary goal? What's the secondary goal? Are there other ways? But I think, it's an important acknowledgement that if you're not trying to do anything innovative, then you get to be safe.
Yeah, and I think it slightly goes back to this point that I was making that really we should be asking investigators and ourselves when they're in a conflicted situation, what is your goal? Is your goal to improve, to do good, etc.? Well, then you should be okay with maybe potentially removing pieces of the conflict. So,
what makes these things complex is that there's not a goal. There's competing goals. There's the goal of advancing the science. There's the goal of promotion. There's the goal of personal benefit. There's the goal of getting your name in the front page of the New York Times. I mean, they're all goals, and they're in competition with one another.
And the
And that-
obligation to get the results of the federal money out to the public where it belongs.
Yeah.
And our own institutions are at war with themselves. You can just read through our own policies and you can see, we want you to consult, we want you out there, and then, be careful, don't consult. That's how you submit this through the triplicate, these are the four brackets.
Well, that may be the term, right? I mean, one of the values of competition is, two people are competing, they run faster. And so maybe it's a competition of interest rather than conflict.
Actually, yeah, I'd say that's interesting. And, I think the issue of NIH wanting things out the door quickly, that ends up then potentially conflicting with this need to have high integrity in the science and really, do good science, not just throw it out there in a sloppy way to get your name out there.
I thought it was interesting though, the slide before, two slides before you talked about your public disclosure maybe on the tents or something like that. It's an interesting, intriguing thought. I guess I look at the data though that shows that disclosure actually sort of promotes comfort. It sort of doesn't matter. People are just going to, it doesn't really matter that they're, my physician is making a lot of money off this. That's cool. Right? So I don't know, I guess it depends on what we feel the goal is, to make us feel better, right? These disclosure policies, it's sort of that, in some ways that's the way it feels. It's like, okay, we've done our duty, we've told them, now it's up to them to make their decision, but we know what that disclosure means, right?
Right.
What the end result is.
I think, the data that I kind of referenced and you're referencing here is where we know that people are comfortable with it. Those are obviously self-selected people into the study. And so I think this gets at the bigger, just general public transparency issue for even people who don't participate in researching and don't know anything about this. And this, thinking about the activities of Senator Grassley a while ago. I mean, that and all the things that got on, LA Times, New York Times, and all that good stuff. I think that does suggest that there is maybe some potential discontent.
Well, I use that, I use Dr. Nemiroff in my slides all the time, right?
Yep.
And then he lands a job, good job in Miami.
So I think, thank you very much. Appreciate your presentation. Very engaging.